Welcome and thanks for tuning in for another episode of the Lead to Win podcast, a podcast focused on exploring strategies, mindsets, and stories behind successful leadership and personal development. On today's episode, I visit with Lauren Cruz. Lauren graduated from the United States Naval Academy in 2006 and spent the following 5 years as a naval flight officer on board the P-3C Orion aircraft, hunting submarines and Somalian pirates, including those who took Captain Phillips captive in 2009, and flying surveillance and reconnaissance missions in the Persian Gulf. She then served 3.5 years at the White House as a communications officer alongside Atlas Altman, who was another guest of the show a couple weeks ago. In 2015, Lauren left the Navy and began a career in financial crimes compliance and fraud prevention in New York City. She's worked for EY, Ernst & Young, PayPal, and recently accepted a position with Goldman Sachs. Throughout her career, Lauren has enjoyed great success employing what she knows as compassionate leadership. In short, she makes it a point to be curious about and empathetic toward the individuals she works with. Not only does she find work much more enjoyable this way, but the results she has gotten have been overwhelmingly positive. Looking forward to this conversation today, and I hope you enjoy it. I'm your host, Bo Bergen. Let's do it. Lauren, welcome to the show, and thanks for coming on today.
Thanks, Bo. I'm really happy to be here.
So give my listeners a little bit more background on you. I know we talked about a little bit of your history, your work history, and what you've done, but tell us a little bit about Lauren, the person.
Sure. So always wanted to go to the Naval Academy ever since I was a little kid. I always liked to say that my dad wasn't the reason for that because he was an alumni as well. But, you tend to do what you see. So I'm sure that had a lot to do with it. I just wanted to be constantly active, and I still find myself filling my schedule. I just really like having a full day and having a lot to do. So that's kind of what drew me to the military in general. When I got into the military, there were a lot of things that were amazing about it, and there were a lot of things that were really challenging. So one of those was that my personal leadership style wasn't always totally aligned with some other military leaders. I know what I would say people's general impressions are of the military is sometimes true. There are some rigid leadership styles. There are some folks who just expect to be obeyed and don't really provide reasons for what they're doing. I've just never been that way. So, I had great experiences, and the White House was one of those places. It was really amazing. But when it came time for me to decide what to do with my life, I wanted to go elsewhere and see whether I could bring my personal style to another field, and kind of made a complete departure, went into finance in New York City with absolutely no experience whatsoever. And since then I've just really been trying to hone my craft, I also just recently got a professional executive coaching certification from Columbia. I got my master's right before I got out of the Navy in industrial and organizational psychology. I'm really fascinated by the psychology of leadership, and I hope to bring some of that to my life, no matter whether it's in my personal life or whether it's in my work life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I want to touch on a topic that we had briefly discussed before this episode, but I was really intrigued by the concept of it, and it's compassionate leadership, and everybody
Mm-hmm.
wants to be compassionate. I mean, compassion is a word that's pretty widely used, but not necessarily in the leadership world a whole lot. Like I said, people want to be compassionate, but I think there's something here, and I hope we can unwrap that a little bit. So overall, in your opinion, how does compassionate leadership contribute to maybe the well-being of your employees and even the productivity of them?
Sure. So I think that the practice of compassionate leadership really just boils down to having a level of curiosity and empathy toward your employees. And I personally, whenever I've found myself in an environment where I feel trusted, feel empowered, feel like someone cares about me and my life and the other contributing factors to my success other than whatever I do at work, um, I am so much more loyal to that manager, to that company. I find myself wanting to work harder. I It's a pleasure to work hard. So in terms of like the well-being of employees, you're gonna have happier employees. You're gonna have people who really want to help you, and especially if you're empowering them to do their job without constant correction. Or, I mean, obviously you need to give guidance, but do that in a constructive way. So,
Mhm. Yeah. Can you share any specific examples of how maybe you've applied compassionate leadership or you were shown compassionate leadership?
sure. I have one really big example that sticks out in my mind, back from my White House days. So I had a very high ranking officer who came in, was brand new to the organization, and our whole job was to create this communications environment for the president when he traveled. Um, this particular mission, I was in Sweden, in Stockholm, and it was my check ride, so to speak. So it was my first time actually being the lead, but I was an incredibly junior person, um, for the position that I held as the lead for this trip. Everybody was on board with that except for this one high ranking guy. For some reason, he came in and thought that he was going to be in charge just because of his rank, even though he had absolutely no experience. He just was very disruptive of the entire process, just to be honest. So there was a morning meeting that I was holding with my team, and I was sort of the hub of a big wheel. There's like, we had radio guys, we had network guys, we had audio visual guys, all of those. Well, I say guys and gals. Um, so all of those people were experts in their field, and all of those people know exactly the nitty gritty and the tiny details of everything that's going on with their personal area of expertise. And I don't. I'm not necessarily down in the weeds. So I like to listen to my people. So I was having a morning meeting, and one of my technicians spoke up about a decision that I had made, about how I wanted to do something. And he said, "Hey, ma'am, just so you know, if you do it this way, this is going to happen. And I think it'd be better if we did it this way." And I immediately was like, "That's great. Thank you for bringing that up. I'm so happy you told me that. I wouldn't have known, and I had absolutely no qualms about this guy bringing this up in a meeting, partly because I want everyone to feel free to bring something up in a meeting. If I shut that down, I'm not going to get the information I need, right? Well, after the meeting, this high-ranking officer that I spoke of pulls me out in the hallway with my senior enlisted and says, "Either you do something about that technician or I'm going to." And both me and the senior enlisted were like, "Oh, yes, sir. What's the problem?" We were like, I don't understand. And so I was able to kind of head him off from going after my technician, and I spoke to him later and told him that I had, stuck up for him. And actually, I will say my senior enlisted went to him and told that technician that I had stuck up for him, and I think that that technician felt like I cared about him. And I mean, that was like a big. It could have turned into a really terrible situation, and I don't want anyone to feel shut down. So that, I mean, yeah. So that's my example of how I would say, like, that's the biggest example that sticks out in my mind. But another example of how it was applied to me, was uh, back in my squadron days. Um, I struggled because I felt like I had this reputation for not being very good at my job. And it was really strange. And one day, while I was on a deployment, one of the department heads in my squadron took me aside and he said, "Hey, I need to talk to you about something." I was like, "What is it?" He says, "Well, Lauren, you have a PR problem." I was like, "What does that mean? I don't know what you're talking about." And he said, "I used to think, based on what I've heard from everyone else in the squadron, that you weren't particularly successful in your position as a tactical coordinator. I just assumed that people were right when they said those things about you. But now that I've flown with you the last few days, I realize that that is completely untrue. And you're actually great at your job. And you, I don't know what I can do for you in that regard, but you need to fix that. You need to like make sure that people don't have this impression of you. Now, if I had been in his position, I probably would have tried harder to help out someone who had a bad reputation. I would like to, I would try to speak out, call people on the misinformation that they were spreading, that kind of thing. And he did not in this situation, but it was very compassionate of him to let me know the things that were being said, because otherwise I would never have a way of knowing. And I think transparency is key. So, yeah, those are the two big stories that stick out from my career.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned both of those because I think, the one thing that I took from that in both situations, there was a perception that you weren't qualified or, maybe you didn't have the experience, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
When that happens, when people have that perception of you, it almost gives them, they feel more empowered to kind of come to you with things you might not be doing right. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I mean, they might
Mm-hmm.
more often, if they think that you're not quite as qualified enough in the job you're doing, they try to tell you how to do your job. So talk a
Mm-hmm.
little bit about that, like the mindset with that. Like, how do you, you didn't have to stick up for the guy that came in and said, "Hey, here's what's going to happen if you do this." You
Mm-hmm.
didn't have to do that, but what's the mindset that kind of went into that?
Well, I think one of the things some people might struggle with is just putting yourself in someone else's shoes. I'm always shocked at behavior I observe that demonstrates to me that you haven't thought about the other person in that situation.
Mm-hmm.
As a leader, I think because I had experiences early in my career where people doubted me or people shut me down for providing input or trying to speak up about something, um, I can recognize when that situation comes up with someone who works for me, or even if they don't work for me, even if they're just somebody that needs somebody to stick up for them. And I recognize that situation because it happened to me. One of the things I think is a really interesting barrier to compassionate leadership is when folks are promoted to leadership positions based on their technical skill and not on their leadership potential. So this happens a lot in, for example, engineering roles, software engineering, anything particularly technical. You might have someone who's very skilled in that technical role. And so the leadership says, well, this person's the best person at this technical skill, so they should obviously be the manager. Well, I've seen that backfire so many times. Um, and the beautiful thing about the military was that I was given so many opportunities to come in at a leadership level without having technical expertise. And it's important to humble yourself in that situation and not think that you know everything. But when you are a person who's come up through the ranks and has technical ability, sometimes you don't have compassion for the people behind you because you're like, well, I know how to do it. How come you don't know how to do it? Or whatever other situation that arises. So, um, yeah, I think it's really just about being able to put yourself in that other person's shoes. Like, have you ever had a teacher who was so smart that he had no clue how to teach?
Oh yeah.
Like, like the guys that like talk to the chalkboard and then just expect you to pick everything up from the equations they read on the board, that kind of thing. But it's because they've never struggled.
Mm.
Having a struggle is really important. And if you never have, then you need to put a lot of work into feeling compassionate towards others.
Yeah, that's really good. If I'm a leader that thinks maybe I'm too harsh, or maybe I don't show enough compassion,
Mhm.
what are some strategies that I could employ to cultivate some empathy and understanding within the people of my team?
So I would say the best answer to this question is something that I have read about. Can't take credit for this one. It's comes from an article I read. Alison Minister, and she talks about the 5 C's of compassionate leadership. So the first one is consciousness. You need to be conscious of any biases that you have. You need to be conscious of any differences between you and your people that you're leading or people you're working with. and just overall consciousness of the fact that you may not know everything about a situation as you're sort of governing it, especially if you're the person making decisions. Um, Second one is compassion, and that one obviously speaks for itself. Just try to put yourself in another person's shoes, understand that they may not have it all together in one moment. They may have some other factors that are contributing to success or non-success. The biggest one I love is curiosity. So being from an investigations background, I really just love the concept of curiosity altogether, because it's very interesting how if you just ask questions and you leave space for someone to speak to you, the things that you find out are pretty amazing. And so if you ask those questions before you lead with any sort of assertions or assumptions, you may avoid making a fool of yourself by saying some of those assertions or assumptions that are going to sound pretty dumb to somebody who hasn't had a chance to explain anything to you, or somebody that knows more than you about a situation. Other two C's are competence and courage. So competence, it's really important as a leader to, I mean, we've been talking about this. You don't need to be a complete and 100% expert in the subject matter of whatever you're leading, but you do need to have a level of competence, and you do need to have knowledge of what someone actually does on a daily basis, what actually goes into their job, what are their tasks on a daily basis. So that's really important. And then courage, it does take courage to humble yourself to ask those questions. And I think the courage to be open yourself, maybe share some of your own challenges and struggles, make sure people know that you don't think you know everything and that you need them to provide you with the information that you don't have. So I mean, those are some strategies. I hope, like, the 5 C's really kind of make sense to me. Biggest one for me is curiosity, totally.
Yep. So how do you balance compassion
Hmm.
with accountability and driving results within your people? That's a
Yeah.
huge, you can come off as soft a little bit.
Hmm.
How do you balance that, holding your people accountable, but also being compassionate toward them?
So I think many folks think that if you're compassionate, you can be walked all over, or you're soft, like you said. I think there's a really big difference between being compassionate and being a pushover. The important thing is to get curious, but if you find in getting curious that someone is taking advantage of your kindness or your empathy, I think that's a really easy thing to figure out. You want to make sure you know everything about a situation, but if you're asking questions and that person just doesn't have good answers for you about why something's not getting done, or you have a lack of confidence in that person's actual ability because you've done some probing and tried to get at what their actual skill level is, and they don't have it, don't have what you need. It's okay to hold somebody accountable. In fact, I think that is the more compassionate thing to do. And then the other part of holding someone accountable is you have to make sure people know what they're being held accountable for. I think, there's a lot of situations where employees get feedback, maybe more criticism than feedback, and they don't really know what to do with it because it's vague. It's not something that they can do something about. They're just, for example, if somebody's talking about me behind my back and saying that I don't do my job well, how am I supposed to fix that? If you're a compassionate leader, you find out the things that people have going on that are preventing them from doing their job. And if that is a lack of desire or work ethic, it's okay to hold that person accountable for that.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. So, what advice would you have for leaders looking to, in terms of leadership style?
Mhm.
Maybe maybe I'm pretty self aware of my leadership style, but I need to tweak that and insert a little bit of compassion, or
Mhm.
really just understanding and some of that curiosity, as you mentioned. What advice would you have for someone like that?
So I've heard this as a technique where if you have challenges with any of your employees, for example, and you're frustrated by someone. You think of the thing that frustrates you about that person, but you also try to pair it with 5 things that you think that person does well. Just sit in it for a second and try to come up with all the other things that that person does that might be great for your organization. Also, I mean, I know I've said it a million times, but like be curious. Like, so for example, if you're frustrated because somebody is coming to work late on a daily basis, maybe you need to get curious about what their home life is. And if it's just that they're terrible at getting to work on time, then okay, so be it. But it may be that they have family issues. They might have, caretaking that they need to do for someone in their family, or they might have transportation issues, and so that's the time to get curious about, well, am I compensating this person effectively for their job? Am I allowing them the time and resources to actually do the thing I'm asking them to do, which is show up at a certain time? Also, maybe get curious about, why does that person need to show up at that time? Maybe an extra half an hour in the morning and they stay a little bit later at night could work. It's important to not think about things from your own agenda. Think about the differences. Another thing I'll touch on is just sort of cultural humility. I think this term used to be more cultural competence, and then there's sort of a connotation that like competence implies that you know about everyone else's culture. And I'm not even talking about like your heritage, your background, that kind of thing. It's any culture that you come from. If you come from a culture like the military, that's a cultural those are cultural things you need to be aware of as a leader. Like whatever cultural things about your employees or the people you work with are going to affect the way they do their job, it's important for you to understand those things. So cultural humility, I would say, is just the exercise of like understanding that there will be differences between you and other people based on a lot of different factors, and learn about it. Try to figure out what those differences are and how they affect the bottom line.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what came to mind when you were talking was, getting to know your employees, obviously, but I've tried a bunch of different ways to do that.
Mm-hmm.
I've found that probably the best way to do that is just having conversations with them on a daily basis and
Yeah.
just checking in. And I know that can become kind of cliche, like, talk to your people, figure out their home life, blah, blah, blah. But have you seen any kind of other strategies on maybe whether it's an assessment or a survey
Mm-hmm.
or something like that, that really gives leaders an idea of how their people want to be led?
So I think surveys can be pretty good if you ask the right questions and if
Mm-hmm.
you actually really examine the input that you get back.
Yeah.
I've seen examples of where a survey goes out and the questions really just don't give people an opportunity to say a whole lot about how they really feel, or to provide like constructive feedback about how things could be better. And so one of the things I actually loved about uh, the job that I had at PayPal was we did this bi-weekly meeting, and they called it rounds. And part of it was, we were all investigators. We all had these crazy cases coming through and like really weird, different like typologies and situations. And some of them were things that we'd never seen before. It was actually really common for us to have things that we'd never seen before. So we would just sit around on this call and we would say like, oh my gosh, I have this thing. It's so crazy. Does anyone have any suggestions? And then we would all just give each other suggestions. Now, part of that, even if it wasn't talking about cases, was talking about different tools that were becoming available, different ways that we could start working on different case typologies. How do we make this easier for ourselves? And so I feel like that constant feedback link. So like it was all of us on the team, but it was also our manager. And she would, really sit and listen. And if there was something that really wasn't working for us, she would take it away and she would see what she could do about it. So I think something like that, like a check-in. I mean, and that's not even just that, talk to your people cliche like you were talking about. But what's so interesting to me is when people aren't curious about their coworkers' lives, like I'm a social person. I wanna understand what makes you tick. I wanna, if you have kids, I have kids, so let's talk about our kids, or what sports are you signing your kids up for, or how's does your spouse work? What did you do in college? Did you play any sports in college? Did you like what do you do in your spare time? Do you like to go to the Renaissance fair? Like let's talk about cosplay. I don't care. Like anything. Like it doesn't matter. But just like get curious. Just start talking to people. Just listen. It's so easy.
Yep.
Yeah.
So, conflict in the workplace is inevitable.
Yeah.
We talked a little bit about it earlier, but how should a leader handle conflicts, or more specifically, like difficult situations that they have to have? But how do they do that with a compassionate approach?
Um, I mean, conflict can obviously be difficult to deal with, especially if you're having a direct conflict with someone else yourself, that's hard enough. But if it's a conflict between others that you're trying to manage and you don't know a whole lot about it, let's start asking questions, right? I think it's important to get the point of view of anyone involved without putting them on the spot in front of a lot of other people, or like, so let's say I have two employees that need to be working together, but it's just not working. Like they're not getting along. First, I need to talk to them individually to understand what the point of view is of each of those employees. Maybe this person's frustrated because this person is just getting in the weeds. Maybe this person is frustrated because this person doesn't understand that getting in the weeds is important. Like you need to understand where each person is coming from. Maybe have sort of a coaching session on how they could be more empathetic toward each other, if that makes sense, like understand each other. And then, if it's going to be beneficial, maybe it's, a sit down with just the two of them that's sort of mediated. Now that's a very specific example. Obviously, there's going to be conflicts where you don't have the opportunity. Maybe the conflict is someone above you is telling you that you need to do something and you just really are frustrated and feel like that's not the right thing to do. I think in those situations, sometimes you just have to keep batting away at it and really just try to figure out a different way to say the thing that needs to be heard, in your opinion. And what I will also say is if you find yourself in a job where conflict is just all you see on a daily basis, it's okay to remove yourself from that situation. I think not everything can be handled with compassionate leadership. And compassionate leadership, any leadership is up and down, right? As an employee to someone else, you should be practicing leadership on them as well, right? Everyone practices leadership on each other. But if you find yourself in a situation where you feel like you're hitting your head against a brick wall on a daily basis and just trying to get through to people and it's just not working and the culture is just not a good fit for you, it might be time to find something else.
Yeah, I,
I
I
don't
think
know if
it's
that
very
answers your
important
question,
for be aware of their surroundings and aware of the culture that maybe they played a part in creating.
but
And maybe it's not working. And I think
yeah,
it's a skill to know when to walk away. You
yeah,
know, but
hmm
yeah, it's all about, I think from a leadership standpoint, like if your quality of life is going down because of that kind of stuff, like that's probably a good sign that you probably need to make a change. So
hmm
I think that's definitely important for leaders to remember.
yeah.
So I think, in my opinion, being a compassionate leader is being slow to judge others on maybe a mistake they made, or I mean, it could be as shallow as their appearance. I mean, that sounds very. I mean, you're not a very good person if you judge people on their appearance, but it happens.
No, but it happens. That's a bias. Like you tend to agree with people who look a lot like you. You
Yeah,
know.
yeah, for sure. But you used a term when we were talking before that I'd never heard of, and that is fundamental attribution error. Can you
Mhm.
explain that a little bit and why it's so important for leaders to understand?
Yes. So I first came across this term in a social psychology class, and it just rang out in my head. because I think I've seen it happen in many different manifestations. So fundamental attribution error, if you boil it down to a sort of a definition, it is attributing another person's actions to a character trait. So something that they do as a behavior, you automatically assign, oh, like this person was late today, so they are lazy. That's just a very simplistic example, but the key to this whole thing is that as an individual, you yourself might cut yourself a break for a behavior because you know what the rational explanation is for that behavior that might not be the best. But when it comes to others, you assign them a character trait or, just an innate quality about them. It's so important not to do this. What I'll give as an example of my own life is when I'm stressed, when I'm in a very, very stressful, anxious situation, which you find yourself in a lot when you're in the military, I tend to kind of go inward. And my outward expression of stress is sort of a flat affect. In some ways, it can be really good because I don't flip out in stressful situations. I calmly assess and, I have that like fight or flight, freeze, spawn, whatever that, instant reaction is. And mine is to sit and really just try to get through it in my own head, but I might not be displaying to others that I am trying to figure it out.
Mhm.
When I was first in the military and I had people screaming in my face and in certain training situations where, I was placed in stressful situations on purpose, a lot of times people would think that I wasn't taking things seriously. So the innate quality that they assigned to me in that situation was, oh, she is being flippant. She doesn't take this seriously. She doesn't care. She's being disrespectful, like any manner of like all of those things. So they were making those judgments about me, like, and that could not have been farther from the truth. I was seriously going inward and processing it as well as I could. And some people have seen that quality and thought of it as a good thing. But a lot of people did not. So I have had to learn to explain those things to other people. So, when people ask me like what my weakness is in an interview, in a job interview, that's what I talk about. Like, I make sure people know that about me right off the bat. Now, if I had a curious and compassionate leader, and maybe they would just be like, "Hey, what are you thinking right now? Hey, like, what's going on in your mind? Are you all right?" And, instead of just assuming that I was disrespecting them in some way and just writing me off. So that to me is fundamental attribution error. I think you, especially if you yourself are going to cut yourself a break on something like being late, on something like not turning in an objective on time, it's important for you to recognize that other people sometimes need to be cut a break too, and there's probably a reason, and you should get curious about it.
Yeah. So what are some of those? We talked a little bit about some biases just a second
Mm-hmm.
ago, but what are some common biases or assumptions that leaders
Mm-hmm.
can that should be aware of, and in order to avoid judging someone unfairly?
So kind of what we talked about a little bit already, like any sort of cultural biases. So that may be a bias where, someone you relate to because you see yourself in them,
Mm-hmm.
partly because they look like you. That's something you definitely need to be aware of and combat as a leader. I also think that a diversity of backgrounds, whether it's your religious background, your job background, your cultural background, your educational background, those things create good productivity. Like there's science behind the fact that if you have a very diverse group of people with different ways of thinking, that's going to be an amazing like contribution to your bottom line. So I mean, teams that are more diverse are more productive, more profitable, like in any study that you look at. So um, when you have a bias against the way someone does something, because it's different from the way you would do it. Maybe just like open up your mind a little bit. Just, try to understand why a person does something like that. I remember going from high school to college even. And it's not like the Naval Academy is like the most diverse place to go to college, but I was coming from this small town in Maryland, and what I realized immediately was that every one of my classmates came from different places in the US, and even just that was a huge cultural difference between us. And like everyone did things really differently. Like, yeah, so obviously, then you have like confirmation bias. Like if you think something is going to happen a certain way and then it does, and then, you kind of orchestrate it so that it does happen that way. And maybe that's still not the best way to do it. Maybe you should do some exploring. I could go into biases all day. There's so many, but for me, it really comes down to the cultural differences um, that you should learn more about, and just never think that the way you've always done something is necessarily the best way.
It could even be just skill set.
Yeah.
Leads to productivity, as you mentioned, but more importantly, I would argue innovation. I mean, not
Mm-hmm.
just getting the job done, but getting the job done in an efficient way, in a new way. I think the more ideas that you bring to the table from different backgrounds, the better.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
I think every leader should gravitate toward that and try to make that happen. So,
Right. And even if it's just that, if you have people with different perspectives, you're going to have a client base, whether your client base is internal, external, like whoever it is you're serving in your job, your client base is going to be diverse. So you need that diversity in your team to understand who it is you're working for and who it is you're producing something for.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good point. So, what advice would you have for leaders on how to practice active listening and empathy to better understand the people that they lead?
So there's this great author I love, and I'm trying to remember. Of course, I have to figure out what her name is. I want to say it's Kelly Connolly, and she wrote a book called The Middle Place, and then she wrote a book called Tell Me More. That's one of my favorite concepts. Tell me more. So when you're speaking to someone and they're telling you a little bit about something, this is what they kind of say in relationships. It's if someone tells you about a problem they're having, don't offer to fix it. Just listen, right? So one really great thing to just learn to say is, tell me more about that. As a coach, like in the training that I got at Columbia, this is one of the biggest like aha moments that I had. And also as an investigator, I investigated internal fraud. So nobody wanted to see me coming on the calendar. If I put a meeting on your calendar, it was not a good thing. But the biggest thing that I did in those interviews to find out what I needed to find out was I would ask a question and then I would leave space. Like people will fill the space. And so if you create a space as a leader where people want to tell you things, part of doing that is just saying, tell me more. Like, just instead of asking a specific question, say, tell me more. And you'd be surprised at the things that people want to share with you if you just seem open to hearing it.
Yeah, absolutely. What I was thinking when I had a guest, been a couple months ago, but I had kind of an aha moment when I was talking to him. He said, when you're trying to develop relationships, and he's a coach and a teacher, but he wants to develop deep relationships with his kids. And, a lot of people just walk down the hallway and say, hey, how's it going? How are you doing? Blah, blah, blah. He started asking why after they gave him an answer. And I was like, man, I need to try that. And I did. And it was awesome. I mean, it catches them off guard at first, but, and some people are like, oh, I'm breathing, that's why I'm good.
Yep.
But other people are like, why am I good? Why am I doing good today? And so it can be a positive thing. And it can also be a very, freeing experience. If somebody's dealing with something, then, hey, let's go talk about it real quick. I know you told me you're good, but you're not. So I think that's a good concept to keep in mind in terms of active listening. I think everybody could work on that, and especially leaders. So,
Yeah.
hey, in
I
closing here,
actually,
yeah, go ahead.
no, I was just gonna say I heard another good technique for talking to your kids, which is you ask them 3 questions every night. Like, what was tricky today?
Mm-hmm.
What were you happy about that happened today? And what's something you want me to know?
Mm-hmm.
Essentially. So like it's sort of like what happened that wasn't so great, what happened that was great, but also is there something that you want me to know about? Just and I've heard great things about like the conversations people have with their kids. Now my children are 4 and 1.5, so I haven't gotten to those philosophical conversations with them
Yep.
yet. But from what I've heard, if you kind of start that young and like at bedtime you do that like little routine every day, it just opens up the dialogue,
Yeah, it's funny. Like when I've got a 6-year-old, she's in
Mm-hmm.
kindergarten, and you can probably think back when you talk to your parents at the house after school,
Mm-hmm.
they'd ask you how'd school go today.
Yeah.
Good. Not really interested in talking about it. Man, they're doing that at
Right.
6 years old now. My
Oh
daughter's
yeah.
like, it was good. It was fine. You asked me that yesterday. You're probably gonna ask me that tomorrow. But yeah, I might have to try those three questions, open up her mind a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
But
Yeah.
yeah, that's a funny example.
But
Hey,
you can do
wrapping
that
up.
with your employees too.
Yeah, absolutely. Wrapping
Yep.
up here.
Yep.
Where can my listeners? Maybe I'm listening to this and I'm like, I like what she's saying. Where
Mm-hmm.
can my listeners find you and some of the work you do?
So this is the tricky situation. I don't have a website yet, but I'm in the process of getting one up. Because I work full time, like I'm still in the process of getting like a coaching business up and running.
Mm-hmm.
You can find me on Atlas Altman's website. He made a small page just so that I have some presence. I've also appeared on another podcast, which I'll like I can send you the link to that one. And I'm hoping to kind of appear on a few more and start making my way into the speaking circuit. I
Mm-hmm.
would love to speak on some stages like Atlas does. He's trying to coach me into that realm. But yeah, as soon as I do have any sort of website, I will certainly let you know, and maybe you can update the podcast. But for now, I'll put like my LinkedIn and my email address, whatever. But I'm here if anybody
Yeah,
wants to coach.
you're semi-private right now. So yeah,
Semi-private, exactly.
we'll update the episode details and make sure to get that website up and
Yep.
linked to the episode. Okay,
Yeah.
last question here.
Sure.
At the end of the day, you've been a few different places. You've probably met a lot of people along the way.
Mm-hmm.
What do you want to be remembered by? What do you want those people to remember you by? And what do you want your legacy to be?
I want to be remembered as someone who listened intently and did not make spot judgments.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's really what it comes down to. I have an identity of like not prejudging anyone or anything. And if anyone calls me out on a way that I'm not doing that, I definitely want to hear it. But I want to be a listener and gain more knowledge. That's what I want. Mm-hmm.
Yep. Well, I really enjoyed this conversation today, and I
Mm-hmm.
can tell that you're passionate about it, and I think that's good. And I think that was evident in some of your answers today to the questions. And I hope my listeners can grab bits and pieces of it and apply it. I plan to. I wrote some notes, so I look forward
Awesome.
to getting better from it. So, hey, Lauren, thanks again. Good luck to you, and I
Thank
look
you,
forward
Bo.
to following you from here on out.
Yeah, I appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Lead to Win podcast. If you're listening this week, make sure to drop a rating on whatever app you're listening on. I'd love to hear from listeners and make this podcast even more relevant to you. Also, make sure to follow the Lead to Win podcast on social media. We're on Facebook, X, Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok. Give us a follow and feel free to share the content. Again, thanks for listening this week. I'm your host, Bo Bergen. See you next Tuesday.